Have you ever kept a family secret for decades? I won't ask what, just curious.
My mother placed the porcelain cup in front of me as if she were setting down an olive branch, her hand trembling only slightly, though her voice carried the smooth confidence of someone who had practiced the gesture in the mirror. She said it was peppermint, my favorite, and she spoke the word apology like it was something expensive she had to ration, a fragile offering that might be revoked if I dared to question the terms. It was the same tone she used when I was 12, and she told me she had simply forgotten the talent show, even though she managed to make it to my sister's piano recitals without fail, often with a bouquet of roses pressed against her chest. I stared at the cup, steam curling upward, and I smiled. I said thank you, because I had learned long ago that to refuse her crumbs was to invite a lecture about gratitude, about how I should appreciate small things instead of resenting what I did not have. Then, while her eyes rested on me, waiting for a sign of reconciliation, I slid the cup across the table, slow and deliberate, toward the sister who once got Paris as a birthday gift. Claire, with her hair styled in that glossy wave she swore was natural, reached for the cup without hesitation, her manicured fingers curling around the delicate handle as if she were holding a trophy. She didn't even glance at me, didn't even wonder why I gave away the one scrap of acknowledgement that had been offered. She lifted the tea to her lips and sipped as though she deserved it by birthright, as though the gesture was hers all along. I sat back, folding my hands in my lap, and listened to the soft clink of porcelain against her teeth. The kitchen smelled faintly of lemon polish from the table my mother had insisted we gather around, though the scent did little to mask the heaviness in the air. My birthday had come and gone last week, celebrated alone with a microwaved dinner and a cheap cupcake from the gas station on the corner, the candle sputtering while I sang to myself. She had texted me busy, rain check, and I knew that rain check was just another way of saying, you are not the priority. Today, though, she tried to stitch over the absence with tea, as though a cup of peppermint could equal the Paris vacation Claire had unwrapped just months earlier, the one I was expected to like on Facebook and comment, "So happy for you." As though envy were not gnawing at my insides. Claire laughed at something trivial, her voice echoing against the tiled walls, but then her laughter snapped short, cut off by a sharp inhale. Her hand rose to her throat as if an invisible hand had closed around it, and the room shifted in an instant. Her chair scraped violently against the floor, her knuckles whitening as she gripped the edge of the table. I watched her chest stutter with shallow gasps, her lips parting, her eyes wide with panic. My mother froze, teacup untouched in front of her, before turning toward me with a stare that burned hotter than the steam rising between us. There was no scream, no outburst, only the sound of Claire trying to force air into her lungs, her breaths jagged and broken. My mother's gaze stayed locked on mine, and for the first time I saw something stripped of all pretense, something that looked more like recognition than shock. It was as though she believed, without words, that I had orchestrated this moment, that the shifting of that cup across the table had not been a whim, but a calculation. I lifted my own glass of water, the condensation cool against my palm, and brought it to my lips. The room seemed to hold its breath with me, the only sound Claire's choked wheezing, and when I swallowed the water it felt louder than it should have, a deliberate punctuation in a silence heavy with accusation. My mother's lips parted slightly, the faintest flicker of a tremor at the corner of her mouth, but she said nothing. My heart pounded, though not with fear. It was something closer to release, a quiet thrill that I buried beneath an expression of mild concern. Claire was still clawing at her throat, her nails scraping faint red lines against her skin, her body doubled over like a marionette with tangled strings. I leaned forward just enough to set my glass down carefully on the table, aligning it perfectly with the grain in the wood. My mother's eyes flicked from the glass to my face, searching, questioning, but I offered her nothing, no smile, no reassurance, no denial. The seconds stretched until they felt like minutes, and then, with a shudder that rattled the dishes on the table, Claire finally sucked in a ragged breath. The gasping eased into coughing, her shoulders shaking, her eyes watering. She collapsed back into her chair, pale and trembling, while my mother rushed to her side, one hand on her back, the other reaching for a napkin. The apology cup sat abandoned, a thin trail of tea dribbling down its side onto the polished surface. I stayed seated, hands folded again in my lap, watching the scene play out like a performance I had seen rehearsed 100 times. My sister the fragile heroine, my mother the devoted protector, and me, always on the edge of the frame. Only this time, the script had shifted, and even if no one spoke it aloud, we all knew the center of gravity had moved. When Claire finally caught her breath, her eyes started to me, wide and wet, and her voice rasped like sandpaper against wood. "What did you do?" she whispered, not to my mother, not even to the room, but directly to me. The silence that followed stretched so long I could almost hear the blood rushing in my ears. My mother's hand stilled on her back, her posture stiff, her attention fixed on me as if the question hung in the air with a weight that neither of them dared to drop. I leaned back slowly, my chair creaking, and allowed the faintest curve of a smile to flicker across my lips before I let it vanish again. The cup sat between us, innocent, ordinary, yet in that moment it carried more history, more resentment, and more possibility than any Paris vacation ever could. And as Claire's voice trembled and my mother's stare grew sharper, I knew that whether or not I had done anything at all no longer mattered. The story had already shifted, and I was no longer the one left behind. Claire's question kept rattling around the kitchen like a loose marble rolling across tile, and although my mother tried to smooth over the moment with the same brisk efficiency she used to hide credit card bills from my father when we were kids, there was no mistaking the way she kept an almost ceremonial distance from the cup, as if proximity alone could memorize her fingerprints. So I decided to act like a grown woman who had learned to survive on scraps and awkward politeness, and I picked up the teapot with my calmest expression, tipped it over my own empty glass, and let a small ribbon of tea slide into the water so that everyone could watch it swirl and vanish. Then I took a generous sip, because if I had done anything at all, which I had not, I would not be so foolish as to demonstrate it at point-blank range, and while I swallowed, I watched my mother's mouth rearrange itself into something like admiration cruelly braided with terror. The thing about families, especially ours, is that everyone insists we are ordinary while we operate like a small-town theater company on opening night, hissing stage directions between clenched teeth and rearranging props with fake smiles that crack under overhead lighting. So while Claire dabbed her eyes and let her breath even out, my mother chirped something about a draft and seasonal allergies. And I nodded sympathetically, because I had learned long ago that sympathy disarms faster than anger ever could. Then I leaned back and noticed the framed photos running along the sideboard where every milestone of my sister's life had its own gilded border, while my milestones lived in a shoebox in the laundry room next to the dryer sheets and the lint roller that shed more than it collected. I could have picked a fight, could have asked whether peppermint had suddenly become a seasonal allergen with excellent timing, yet I kept my voice level as I asked if anyone wanted dessert, because the safest kind of revenge, the sort that leaves no fingerprints and echoes proudly in the halls of memory, is the kind that sounds like good manners while it rearranges the furniture in people's heads. And when my mother blinked with surprise, I opened the freezer and retrieved the single-serve cheesecake she keeps for unexpected company, the one that always appears when neighbors drop by but never for me, and I plated it with a flourish that would have made any restaurant server nod in approval. As I set the plate in front of Claire and slid a fork beside it, I told a breezy little story about the time we were teenagers, and she swore the new yoga instructor was an undiscovered talent who should lead a wellness retreat in Malibu. How she swore she could organize sponsors, and how, for a month, our mother introduced her at church potlucks as our little entrepreneur, and how the plan collapsed when the instructor changed studios and Claire forgot to send a single email, which was a generous way to say she gave up, and I laughed lightly at my own punchline so no one could accuse me of meanness, while Claire blushed the particular shade of someone who has never had to sit with the heat for long. My mother said that was ages ago, and I agreed, just like the missed baseball games, the dance class I took for one semester until the carpool fell through, the way I learned to braid my own hair by watching online tutorials while my sister got salon appointments before prom, and I said all of this not with bitterness, but with that practiced tone of a person who has learned to turn old hurts into polite anecdotes, which is how women survive family dinners without flipping the table. Then I lifted my glass for a tiny toast to new traditions, to adult daughters and second chances and peppermint tea that tastes like truce instead of consolation prizes, and I watched the relief flood my mother's face because she believed, for one shimmering second, that I had chosen peace over perspective. It felt almost like a kindness to let the quiet settle, so I spooned a bite of the cheesecake and set it on a smaller plate for myself, humming the way my mother hums when she irons, and while Claire poked at her portion with theatrical caution. I mentioned that I had brought a little gift, something I thought they would both appreciate, nothing expensive or glamorous, nothing from Paris or a boutique with velvet hangers, just a printed mock-up of a family calendar I had designed on my laptop, with birthdays and anniversaries and reminders for calls, color-coded labels, and a small space under each date for notes like "bring flowers" or "send card." And when I unfolded it on the table the way a magician unveils a harmless scarf that turns into a dove, my mother leaned forward as if charmed by the practicality while Claire rolled her eyes. But then I pointed out a tiny detail I had added in faint gray ink at the bottom of each month, a repeating line that said "no rain checks," and I smiled as if I had told a joke I barely understood. My mother praised the layout, said it was thoughtful, said it would help, and for a moment I almost believed we could reset to something gentler, until Claire chuckled and asked if I planned to bill them like a project manager, which sounded like the old script again. So I shrugged and said that if reminders saved everyone embarrassment, then it was a bargain at any price, and then, very casually, I slid an envelope from my bag and handed it to my sister, telling her that if she preferred something more personal than a calendar, perhaps she would like the folder I had assembled with screenshots and printouts from her travel posts, the ones from that Paris trip our mother arranged, where every caption sang about the joy of independence while the metadata betrayed the exact dates and times of the bookings made with our mother's account, and I watched her expression tilt, just a degree, not panic exactly, more like vertigo. She smiled with her lips and not her eyes and asked what I wanted, and I said I wanted nothing other than accuracy, because accuracy, unlike gossip, does not spoil under bright light. Then I told her she should open the envelope after I left, because not everything needs an audience, and I laid my hand flat on the table so they could see it was steady. Then I looked at the cup again, the innocent white curve glinting under the pendant lamp, and I told them I would be bringing my own tea next time, which sounded like a joke until it didn't, and my mother's gaze sharpened like a needle pulling a thread through heavy cloth. Before I stood to gather the dishes, I took my small slice of cheesecake and, with all the performative warmth of a game show hostess, slid it across to my mother, telling her that an apology tastes better when shared, that it goes down easier when everyone gets a bite, and I held her stare while she lifted the fork and tried to pretend she was not wondering whether I had planned this evening down to the last crumb. Then I thanked them for dinner, tucked the calendar back into my bag, and said I would text later with a few dates for the next month, because schedules work better when they are public, and as I reached the doorway Claire's phone buzzed on the table, loud and insistent, and her face blanched in a way no peppermint tea could cause as she glanced at the screen and whispered, barely audible, that someone had just logged into her travel account from a location that was not her home and not mine, which might have been a glitch or might have been a reminder that visibility is a form of power, and I paused long enough to let that settle before I said goodnight and stepped into the hall where the air, blessedly cooler, felt like a rehearsal room before the curtains rise. I drove the short distance home with the windows cracked just enough to let in a ribbon of cool night air that did nothing to lift the heaviness threading through my shoulders, replaying the kitchen scene like a tedious courtroom transcript in which every cough, every twitch, every unsaid word could be entered into evidence, and although I had left with the practiced grace of someone who refuses to give the show an extra act, I felt the old childlike ache rise at the base of my throat, the one that used to arrive every time I watched my sister walk out the door to something glittering while I stayed behind to wash plates and praise responsibility. So I did what adults do when they do not want to cry, which is to move, to clean, to sort, To name objects and line them up as though order alone could legislate fairness into a family that never learned how to count beyond the arithmetic of favorites. The apartment smelled faintly of citrus cleaner from the morning's burst of virtue, and as I set my bag on the counter I noticed how quiet the place felt, the kind of quiet that has edges, not empty exactly, more like a bell jar lowered over the room. And I stood there in that curated silence thinking about my mother's eyes during the choking spell, not frightened so much as lucid, a look I had seen only once before when I was a teenager, and she cut the birthday cake into unequal slices with the sanctimony of a surgeon, giving Claire the first and largest while she told me that life teaches girls who are not breathtaking to become indispensable. The sort of advice that sounds noble until you realize it is an instruction manual for becoming invisible. I poured water into my own kettle and let it heat slowly, more for the ritual than the drink, and while it rumbled I opened the small drawer where I keep the oddities that make people smile at cocktail parties, items that look like props until you know how I use them. And I pulled out the little lab test kit I had ordered months ago for no reason other than that curiosity is a survival skill, thin paper strips in a foil sleeve and a couple of sterile vials that click shut with a satisfying finality. And as I laid them on the counter I thought about how easily suspicion can sprout where trust has been salted away for years, how a teacup can become a weapon or a mirror or a referendum on who gets believed, and I decided that, come morning, I would turn that kitchen into a stage where evidence, not theatrics, would determine the plot. Before I could plan the choreography, my phone lit up with a text from Claire, a single bubble that read like a prayer disguised as a dare, telling me that the login alert had been a fluke and that she hoped I would not make tonight a thing, which was her favorite way to reduce a rupture to a hairline crack, and I stared at her message long enough to feel the familiar temptation to soothe, to comfort, to hold her hand through a crisis of her own design, yet I remembered the way she asked, "What did you do?" and the way our mother's hand had hovered over the teacup like a moth over a lamp, and something brisk and disciplined clicked into place inside me, not rage, not even bitterness. Simply a decision to stop negotiating with narratives that were drafted without my consent. I wrote back that I would swing by in the morning to return a scarf I had borrowed, which was a harmless pretext that would let me walk in without drama. And I packed the vials into a small pouch with the foil sleeve of strips and a clean glass jar because theater requires props. Then I sat at the table and drafted a message to both of them in the family thread, cheerful and brief, thanking them for dinner and for the apology tea, and letting them know, with the tone of a neighborly public service announcement, that I would drop off a little test kit tomorrow so everyone could be at ease, not because I suspected anything but because the mind loves certainty, and I added a wry line about how peppermint should not double as a plot twist, pressing send before I could talk myself out of it. Sleep came in unruly pockets that smelled like old paper and school hallways, memories of me as a girl counting the ways to make myself useful while the house rotated around my sister's orbit, and when the morning finally clicked into place I showered, dressed in something that made me look like a neutral witness rather than a defendant, and drove back to my mother's house with a calm that felt almost theatrical, rehearsed, but sincere, like the truth when spoken slowly. The front door was unlocked because it always is in that neighborhood where people wave at delivery drivers and gossip travels faster than emergency vehicles. And my mother was already in the kitchen with the teapot as if the previous night had been a hiccup rather than a crack, while Claire sat at the table scrolling with the exaggerated nonchalance of someone determined to look unbothered. And I set my pouch on the counter with a brightness that felt like contempt wrapped in friendliness. Then I said I had brought something to make sure nobody writes a ghost story about our family dinner, and I took out a strip and dipped it in water for demonstration, letting the pale line bloom into nothing alarming. After which I poured a small sample from the same peppermint canister into the glass jar and sealed it with a pop that made my mother flinch. Claire told me I was being dramatic, which coming from her had the unintended charm of a street preacher denouncing volume, and I said I was simply being practical. Then I labeled the jar with the date and the word peppermint, my handwriting steady. And I slid a second strip across the table to her like a dealer offering a free hand, telling her that if she wanted to banish last night's sensation she could dip it and watch science perform the world's least thrilling magic trick, and I smiled. just enough to be pleasant while she rolled her eyes and declined, which suited me fine because the point had already landed. Suspicion is loud, but accountability hums, and in a quiet kitchen it carries. My mother said we did not need theatrics, and I agreed warmly while tucking the jar into my bag, adding that the clinic near my office tests samples for a small fee and returns results in a couple of days, and as I said it I watched the flicker cross her face. That tiny acknowledgement that for once the shape of the story was not solely in her keeping, and I sealed that feeling with a small bow of my head and an exit line that sounded like a joke, but was not, promising to share the results so we could all go back to peppermint meaning peppermint instead of the kind of thing people whisper about after church. On my way out, the sun pulled like liquid metal across the driveway, and I paused at the end of the walk because my phone vibrated again, a new message that arrived with the intimacy of a finger tapping my shoulder. And when I opened it I saw Claire's name and a sentence that landed like a knock at midnight, asking me to check under my bed because she knew what I had done. A claim wrapped in certainty and malice, which would have been laughable if not for the cold thread of possibility it tugged, and I stood there in the grainy light with the labeled jar in my bag and the echo of last night still in my throat, realizing that the real performance might not be happening at my mother's table at all, but in the quiet of my own apartment where someone had taken the liberty to arrange a prop for an act I had not planned. I stood just inside my apartment door long enough to hear the soft swallow of the latch catch behind me. Then I crossed the room with the deliberate pace of someone entering a museum after hours, careful not to disturb the stillness while also refusing to be frightened by it, because I have learned that fear is only useful when it keeps you awake and useless when it keeps you small, and although Claire's late-night message had been engineered to make me small, I decided to honor only the part of it that asked me to look, so I set my bag on the table, knelt on the polished floorboards, and lifted the bed skirt as though revealing a magician's secret compartment, which, in a way, I suppose it was. The box waiting in the dustless shadow did not belong to me, not the way a scent can belong, not the way a scuff on a baseboard can tell you about a life, and as soon as I dragged it into the light I had the distinct impression of a stranger breathing on my nape. Not because I am fanciful, but because intrusions carry their own weather, and the air had shifted in that particular, unmistakable way. Inside the box lay a stack of photographs in which I appeared only as a sliver of shoulder or a hand mid-gesture because someone had taken great care to slice around my face, then tuck the edited memories back into their envelopes like tidy little autopsies, and under those envelopes lay a narrow brown bottle with a droplet cap and no label. A laboratory riddle wrapped in something domestic, along with a folded note that had been torn from a shopping list pad and scrawled with one sentence in a careful script that mimicked our mother's hand almost perfectly. You never could keep up. I held the bottle up to the kitchen light and watched the liquid cling to the glass with a syrupy hesitation that suggested concentration rather than harmlessness, and, because I am not reckless, I did not open it. Yet, because I am not sentimental, I did not cry either, instead letting the discovery align with the rest of the puzzle in the quiet cabinet of my mind where I file all the times I have been edited out. Then I reached into my bag for the little test kit and a second jar and I swabbed. Sealed and labeled with the methodical calm of a librarian cataloging a rare and unpleasant book, after which I wiped the counter, put on lipstick the color of late cherries, and considered what it would feel like to step back into my mother's kitchen carrying not accusations, but options. By the time the brunch invitation arrived in the family thread, as if summoned by my decision rather than issued by theirs, I already knew that I would attend with my calmest smile, that I would compliment the floral tablecloth and ask how the neighbor's hip replacement had gone, that I would bring a cheerful paper bag with a bakery stamp and a box of cream puffs inside, and that tucked beneath those cream puffs would ride the brown bottle, now double-bagged in a tiny zip pouch and wrapped in a receipt from a pharmacy Claire likes to name-drop because it smells like money and eucalyptus, which mattered only because my sister, who always believes in her ability to style a crisis, would arrive late with a tote that has no zipper and a habit of dropping it near the banquette while she hugged our mother with a squeal that sounds like innocence. The restaurant chosen for the occasion was one of those places that believes daylight forgives everything, with windows tall enough to make you confess awkward truths and servers who call everyone friend while keeping score for sport. And I let the light do its work as I set down my paper bag, admired the teapot that had already been ordered for tradition, and asked after Claire's health with a concern that would read as sincere even to skeptical eyes, because sincere is not a synonym for naive. Then I watched her dig for her lipstick, lift her tote, and set it on the empty chair beside her in a way that invited a passerby or a relative to tuck something into its gaping mouth, which I did while our mother waved to a neighbor across the room, my hand moving with the practiced economy of someone who has spent her life resetting tables after other people's celebrations. The performance, once begun, does not require theatrics, so I let time unspool like ribbon while we discussed grocery prices and local elections and our mother's insistence on paying for everything, and when Claire excused herself to the restroom, I sipped my tea. Not peppermint this time, something floral and forgettable, and placed the bakery box in front of our mother with a flourish that felt like a bow on a peace offering. Then, when Claire returned, cheeks pink and eyes bright, I asked her to take the first cream puff in honor of the Paris trip that had taught her, according to Instagram, how to save her life, and she laughed, took one, and bit down with a small groan of pleasure that told the room she was still the girl who deserved the first slice. My revenge in that moment was not the planted bottle, though it lay in her tote like a seed with perfect instructions, but the document envelope I produced with theatrical humility and slid across to our mother. A neat packet that contained printouts of the calendar I had designed with family obligations highlighted, birthdays circled, and at the bottom a single line stating that apologies are sweetest when timely, then under that line a small, precise copy of the receipt for Claire's Paris flights made from our mother's account, which I had found in a shared email archive so neglected it had become a time capsule, and I smiled as my mother's pupils widened and narrowed like a camera adjusting to sudden glare. Then I closed the envelope again with my fingertips so she could not claim she had read wrong. Claire sensed the temperature shift and reached for her tote in that instinctive way people check that their wallets still exist when sirens pass, and I watched her hand pause as it brushed the hard outline of the zip pouch. That moment of startled calculation moving across her face like a fast cloud across water, which would have been satisfying enough if our mother had not, in that same beat, turned from me to her with a complicated softness that had never once been mine, and said in a voice that carried the faintest tremor of fatigue that some girls are born to be captivating while others are born to be caretakers, and that families survive because caretakers learn to be clever, not loud. After which she fixed me with a look that folded decades into a single second and murmured, almost kindly, almost cruelly, "Just like your father." A sentence that dropped between us like cut crystal meeting stone and left the three of us staring at one another through the shards of a story I realized I did not know nearly as well as I thought. I did not answer my mother's murmur immediately because the sentence seemed to unfurl a corridor lined with doors I had never opened, each one labeled with a version of him I had not been allowed to meet. And instead, I placed my palms flat on the linen as if pressing wrinkles from a shirt before an interview. Then I asked, in a voice that managed to be both pleasant and precise, whether we might for once stop assigning women to their stations like we were drafting a seating chart for a banquet. In a century that is mercifully over, and in the space that followed, I slid the envelope back to my bag, signaled for the check, and told them I would host dinner that evening at my place, because if peppermint had become mythology, perhaps it was time to bring the story into a room where the props were mine and the exits were familiar, a suggestion that hung in the bright restaurant air like a light fixture humming just a shade too loud. They arrived just after dusk. The heat of the day softened to something almost forgiving, and I had laid the table with the stubborn elegance of a person who has been told too many times that she is better suited to backstage. The glassware lined up with quiet symmetry, the cutlery catching candlelight, the pitchers of water beating with condensation like small truths choosing their moment, and I welcomed them with the easy cheer of a hostess in a commercial for everyday bliss while inside I marshaled the evening's order. First, the results. Second, the bottle. Third, the question that had lived in my throat since childhood. Last, a gesture that would let us all leave knowing exactly who we were, even if we did not say it aloud. I poured water into 3 identical glasses and placed one by each plate with the care of a dealer at a card table, then set a 4th glass in the center as if for an unseen guest. After which I took from my bag the small white envelope stamped with the clinic's logo and read, without flourish, the only sentence that mattered, that the contents of the peppermint sample were unremarkable and safe, that there was no trace of anything that would cause distress, which meant either that last night's scare had been a theatrical spasm of nerves or that the wrong thing had been tested, and I let the duality settle like dust in sunlight, visible to anyone willing to squint. My mother's shoulders dropped a fraction, and Claire pushed her chair back a squeak as if startled by her own relief, yet before either could draft a conclusion that positioned me as hysteric or saint, I placed the brown bottle on the table with the gentle finality of a gavel and said that this, too, had been tested, that whatever clung to those glass walls had been nothing more sinister than a concentrated herbal extract cut with glycerin, potent only in taste, and the stories we were ready to tell about one another, which drew from my mother the kind of exhale people make at funerals when the priest assures them the deceased loved them in his own way, a sound that is not quite grief and not quite absolution, while Claire glared at the bottle as if it were a mirror that had chosen the worst angle. I did not ask who had placed the box beneath my bed nor demand a confession for the photographs that tried to crop me out of myself, because I had learned the hard way that a confession asked for is a verdict denied. And instead I asked my mother about the father I was apparently like, whether he had been clever or cruel, caretaker or captain, whether he had liked peppermint or whiskey, whether he had watched his daughters choose chairs and cups and rolls with the weary omniscience of a man who knows the plot and has run out of intermissions. She looked at the candle, not at me, and said with the softness of hoarded tenderness that he had been steady until he wasn't, that he had loved the quiet and hated favors, that he believed fairness was not a pie to be sliced, but a lamp to be moved around the room, and that when the lamp refused to move he packed a bag so small it insulted the idea of staying, leaving behind a marriage and a map that told us how to keep going while ignoring the cliffs. Her eyes finally met mine with a complicated pride that made my ribs ache, and she said that sometimes she had given Claire the first slice, because it was easier to keep one child busy than to risk losing both to their separate hungers, that she had mistaken noise for need and competence for excess, that she had given me chores because I was good at them and medals to my sister because she asked, and while these explanations did not taste like justice, they had the gritty texture of reality, and I let them sit on my tongue without swallowing because acknowledgement is not forgiveness, but it is a meal, and I had come prepared to eat. My sister, irritated by the direction of the light, tried to pivot us back to safer narratives by asking whether I still believed last night had been anything other than melodrama. And I smiled the kind of smile that has kept women alive at tables where their appetites were not welcome. Then I lifted the center glass, filled it with water from each of the 3 pitchers in turn, a slow, visible blend, and set it back down untouched. A clear liquid now made from all our sources, and I told them that truth in families rarely comes as a single ingredient, that it arrives like a punch bowl where everyone swears they stuck to soda until the room begins to tilt, that what mattered was not the peppermint or the bottle or the way my sister choked on air, but the fact that for the first time I had forced us to name the ingredients within reach, and that naming, more than tasting, was the act of control people mistake for poison when they are used to being the only ones who pour. I stood, gathered the plates, and returned with a tray of lemon slices and mint sprigs and a small glass jar of honey, because Americans love the comfort of customizing their own sweetness, and I could give them that without giving up the recipe. Then I raised my own glass and drank long and openly while watching their hesitation, the tiny delays that bloom when the story's narrator changes mid-chapter, and I felt something in me settle, not triumph and not peace, more like alignment, as if a painting I had hung crooked years ago finally clicked into place against its nail. Before they left, I handed each of them a copy of the calendar printed on heavier stock. The line at the bottom changed from "No rain checks" to "Bring your own cup," which made my mother laugh despite herself and made Claire scowl in a way that suggested she would tape hers to the inside of a cabinet and read it in secret. And at the door my mother touched my cheek with a careful palm and said that caretakers who learn to be clever often become dangerous, then added, after a breath that might have been a prayer, that dangerous women are sometimes exactly what a family needs when it has spent too long in the dark. When the hall light shut behind them and the apartment fell quiet again, I walked back to the table and picked up the untouched center glass, held it to the candle to watch the faint tremor of flame shiver through it, and then, because endings deserve clarity even when they refuse clean answers, I carried it to the sink and poured it down the drain without tasting a drop, aware that somewhere in the city my sister would be checking her tote in sudden fits, my mother would be staring at a calendar that gave her no excuses, and I would be here, still and alert, knowing that the next time a cup moved across a table, every eye would follow it, not out of fear of poison, but out of respect for the hands that had learned, at last, to decide where the story goes.